panelists, and I think it's about the time to start. And in every session, I've seen always the overtimes because the topic has been too how to say that? To hit, okay. Anyway, today we are going to talk about the carbon pricing mechanism. Just like we know that it's been always the most difficult part of this convention, trying to reach the goal of temperature control. But remain the emission reduction is the huge gap, so that the people expect a lot out of the newly established, we say that the carbon pricing mechanism provided by Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And today we would like to bring in some of the panelists in the field and with very unique and special experiences in either exemplify so far probably the most notable bilateral cooperation scheme, that's the J-Credit, that promoted by the Japan, and I think that Mr. Takahashi-san is going to introduce to us about this. And after that, I think that the very, the well-known expert, Axel Mikolova, I think everybody knows that he's so professional in the Article 6 mechanism. And also he take part in this new mechanism development as well. And we will invite him to give us a more comprehensive description or coverage about the update of this mechanism. And certainly on the screen will be Professor Mahalin. Welcome, Professor Mahalin. Okay, and we know that the CBAM newly promulgated and just passed by the EU has been the new topic for the incoming global trade negotiation. And it's supposed to be the extensive coverage of carbon pricing. So we would like to invite him to give us some update information in this regard as well. And also, probably very few people here know that Taiwan took a very unique approach to take like the carbon levy vis-a-vis the carbon tax. And somehow people think it's important to have the explicit carbon pricing mechanism that could be recognized as normal. But in Taiwan, would the carbon levy be a good one? And could that fit for the future carbon baseline measurement to fit the challenge of the CBAM? Well, I will see maybe Mr. Lian from the ITRI of Taiwan will explain to us a little bit in this regard. In any way, today we try to bring in the specialists from different fields and trying to bring to all the audience a more inclusive coverage of what the carbon pricing mean and what could that be functional in supporting what we need to fill out the gap between the carbon reduction we expect to reach the goal of 1.5 control. Okay, because the Makashi-san is really in a very harsh time schedule, so we'd like to invite him to give us a talk first, please.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much for a kind introduction. My name is Kentaro Takashi. I'm a Deputy Director of the Climate and Energy area. And first of all, I would like to thank you for giving these opportunities. From our organizations, we would like to share our experiences on the capacity building. Because as you know, government Japan, they just established the Article 6 implementation partnership at COP27. And also after G7 climate and energy environment minister meeting in Sapporo this year, the government of Japan also established the Article 6 implementation partnership center. So from my presentation, I would like to share and also the future schedule. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Ministry of the Environment in Japan established the Article 6 Implementation Partnership Center after the G7 Climate, Energy, and Environment Minister meeting in Sapporo. So the objective of this center is to provide the technical support for developing country, especially who really want to use the Article 6. So far, after COP27, we just launched the Article 6 Implementation Partnership. And so far we have 100 organizations, so 68 countries and 32 organizations joins in this partnership. So through this center, we are planning to develop a series of the tools related to the authorization, reporting, and tracking, because, as you know, still the negotiation is ongoing, but authorization, reporting, and tracking will be the important elements for participating requirements on the Article 6. And also, we are planning to provide the technical support for host party, because the always, as you know, the negotiations, some of the parties still have a limited knowledge and experiences on the authorization reporting. So we try to develop the package including the authorization and also reporting tracking. And also outreach and also capacity building support is very much important. So through this center, our organization will serve as a secretariat, and we try to accelerate more activity in the next maybe coming 2 or 3 months. So next slide, please. So this is the structure of the Article 6 Implementation Partnership Center. So IGES, we are located in the Japan, and unfortunately, our head office is very far from the Tokyo area, and it takes more than 2 hours from the Tokyo by bus and train. But our actually building is very located in the quite good area, and so now we have this kind of structure, and our organization will serve as a secretariat. And also to get more advice and also future directions, we are planning to establish a steering committee who will consist maybe 4 or 5 countries and also international organizations. Through this steering committee, we are trying to develop more strategy and also future directions. And we are still trying to nominate 4 or 5 members from the country, and also maybe 2 or 3 members from the organizations. And as I mentioned, through this center, we provide technical support, and also we are promoting more outreach so that the participating party can get more access on the very rich information on the Article 6. And next slide, please. So this is the future schedules in 2023. Before the launching of this center, we have already organized a first plenary meeting and also first working group. So we already organized an authorization reporting and tracking working group by inviting government officials as well as international organizations, UNDP, World Bank, and UNFCCC. And after June, we are going to develop and prepare the tool which will be used for capacity building in the several countries. And after September, we resume again the second working group on authorization reporting tracking before the COP28, and we are trying to get more outcomes all through this working group. So so far we are a little bit quite limit the number of the participation on the authorization, the working group, because of the this topic is related to the government official. But we are going to plan to organize some workshops for the private sectors, because the engagement and the participation of the private sector is very much important to develop the Article 6 activity. So this is our full schedule, and in 2024 we are also expanding more activity in the futures. So next slide, please. So this is just our initial idea how to develop the capacity building package, and I think especially for Article 6 implementations, there are several stages, and maybe a readiness, institutional arrangement, and authorization, and also corresponding adjustment is very important to avoid double counting. And also management of the institutions is also quite important. So for each process, we are planning to provide more outcomes. So in case of the readiness, we are going to develop the guidebook, and also we are also planning to prepare several materials for the government official as well as the private sector so that they can have more understanding. So next slide, please. And I think reporting is also quite important before 2024. As you know, at COP27, outline of the initial report and regular information has been already adopted, and annual information, especially draft agreed elective format, AEF, also still discussing and try to finalize this year before COP28. So for the participating party, I think the preparation for those three reports are very much important. So we are trying to provide how to fit in and how to show the text in each report. So maybe through the individual consultations or informal workshop will be organized in the selected countries. So next slide, please. So as for the tracking, I think this also still under the discussion in the negotiation. So UNFCCC and also World Bank, UNDP, they also trying to provide more capacity building, and actually the role of our center is to facilitate more discussion among these three those organizations. And Ministry of the Environment Japan, they already signed the collaborations on this center with UNFCCC and World Bank. And also we have a quite good collaboration with the UNDP. So in the futures, through this center, we are trying to share several options for tracking so that participating party can track the ITMOS transfer in the future. So this is the most end of my presentation. So next slide, show, please. And so from our centers, we can see the Mount Fuji very clearly, especially in the winter season. So, and also we are still now welcome the participation from the country and organization. So if you want to join, so please scan this QR code. And if you have any inquiries and I think the questions, please contact our new address, which is now projected here. So thank you very much. And back to the moderator.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Takahashi. Because Takahashi's son is need to go to another meeting. So would there be any quick questions? I can allow like one. Oh, okay. You raise the hand together. So two, okay? Lady first. Okay.
Development law. And sorry, I'm wondering to what extent you're using the experiences of countries such as Thailand, Switzerland, that have already done, for instance, national registries for projects, and to what extent you're using that for really gaining time. Thank you.
So maybe we have another question, so you answer together. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Takashi-san. I'm Takashi Hongo, and I am Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute, as well as an ITRI board member. Thank you very much for your comment on private sector's involvement. I think it is a really important message because the emission, or who emitted, it's a private sector, and who provided technology, it's a private sector. And also who invests in the project, private sector. Private sector's involvement is definitely important, but I'm not sure what kind of consultation or what kind of collaboration with the private sector. I have no idea about so far. So could you explain a little bit more about what kind of process and what kind of cooperation do you are expecting to have? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. To the two questions, and to respond to the first questions, in each working group on the authorization, reporting, tracking, we invited Thailand as well as the Switzerland for their participation. And I think in the first working group from Switzerland, they kindly share the process for authorization as well as tracking. So still, we are trying to seek some more future collaboration, but I think this sharing the experiences from the Switzerland and also other country was really helpful for participating organization. So the currently is that's kind of the information sharing we are using through this center. And to respond to the second questions, currently we are planning to collaborate with, of course, IETA, International Emissions Associations, Training Association. And I think in the current stage is still, I think the government is trying to prepare the legal framework. So maybe in the first year or first stage, we may just sharing the current status of each party. And I think the next year, as soon as the Article 6.4 supervisory body develops the process and some project cycle, we can explain more what kind of the rule will be adapted in the Article 6.4. So that kind of the maybe step now we are trying to prepare for the private sector's capacity building. So if my answer is clear, I very much
Okay, thank you very much, Takashi-san. I know that the IGs has been working closely together with the UNDP, World Bank, and FCCC. So hopefully in the near future, they will contribute to the well-established system in the near future, I think so. And I think a lot of people will count on this to seek for the IG's capacity building support in the future, especially a lot of friends coming from developing countries. So let's thank you for your presentation and your time. I know you are in the round.
Thank you very much. And I have to leave now. So if you have any question, please, contact us. Yeah.
Okay, so Professor Mehalin, so you can hear us, right? Well, it's great to see you again. I know that now you are in Finland. And just like I mentioned earlier, the CBAM really released in Europe really bring a lot of the challenge to the world, especially it's been taken as kind of the extensive coverage of the carbon pricing mechanism. And that really bring a lot of the challenge and impact to the export-oriented countries and a lot of developing countries as well. So could you explain to us a little bit and update what's going on right now about this system, please? You can have the floor now. We don't hear you. Mm-hmm. 底下关着麦克风关着。还是没有。That's mute, right? Virtual play phone muting. Still not clear. 那这边写 virtual play phone muting.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Clear now.
Okay.
Please repeat.
Okay, thank you. Apologies. There are so many options, you know, in the settings. So my apologies. That was at my end. As I was saying, Professor Tientefan, it's a pleasure to be with you. And last time we had an update on CBAM was during COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh. So some things have happened since. I have slides, but I understand that I cannot share them from my computer. This is no problem. I'll just give a narrative report. So in Sharm el-Sheikh, of course, there was still the political agreement between the European legislative institutions had not happened. So there were proposals from the European Parliament, there were amendment proposals from the European Council or from the Council of Ministers to change the Commission proposal. And we didn't know the final shape of the CBAM. But then in December and around mid-December, the political institutions reached a compromise. However, it took several more months to finally get to the formal closure of that process. So really only last month in May is when the CBAM regulation was finally signed and formally entered into force with publication in the EU official journal. And now we have the document, really the final legislative act in the official journal. It even has a number. So it is now Regulation 2023/956, and you can easily find it if you look at, for instance, search for CBAM regulation. So that is the official final version that answers questions about the design and implementation, but not all questions. There's some really, really important questions that we don't yet have full answers for. The European Commission is still working full steam. Now that the CBAM regulation is in force, they have a formal mandate. Before, they didn't really have that mandate yet. Now they have the formal mandate to elaborate about 12 implementing acts and some delegated acts that operationalize the design details of the CBAM. And without those, really, some important questions, we can't still really give guidance on how exactly that has to be implemented. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that trade partners in countries around the world, so producers of covered goods, probably also in Taiwan, are wondering, how exactly do we do the compliance with the CBAM regulation once it starts operating this October? Namely, most importantly, how do we measure or monitor the emissions embedded in these goods? How do we report that? Who can verify to do the third-party verification? For those that are not familiar with the CBAM, so that was just sort of a quick update where we stand on the political process. CBAM regulation is now in force, but some really important details have yet to be elaborated. Today, even, the European Commission might publish a draft implementing act on exactly the MRV questions, and it will be available for consultation, for providing feedback for a few weeks before it can then be adopted. But everything is moving very, very fast. So that's the update, if you like, on the politics. For those that don't know, what is the CBAM? I'll give a very brief explanation. So I think most of you, as Professor Gianfan has mentioned, have heard about it. It's certainly discussed a lot in any country that has trade in goods with the EU, at least trade in these covered goods. It's a policy tool that the EU is adopting to essentially extend, if you like, the carbon price that is imposed on certain European products to imported goods in order to deal with competitiveness concerns and prevent emissions leakage. So avoid that having a carbon price that is, as you know, fairly high in the EU on these goods leads to relocation of production and investments so that the emissions occur in other countries and are not really reduced globally, whereas the EU loses production, revenue, jobs, and so on. And so this carbon border adjustment mechanism, the way it works is that imports of these goods, of these covered goods, will have to buy certificates. They're not the same thing as allowances. They're not fungible, but they will be priced based on the average closing price of European Union emissions trading system allowances during the previous week. So they will have roughly the same price as the carbon price in the EU. And now the critical question is which goods? So the European Commission, as I already had described in our last meeting of this kind, had proposed covering 5 basic products: iron and steel, cement, and some products like clinker, etc., electricity, fertilizer, and aluminum. And during the political debates last year, one additional product category was added: hydrogen. So now it's 6 product categories, fairly upstream, so definitely the basic, really the basic raw material, if you like, as well as some more processed goods. For instance, iron and steel, you also find that fasteners, nuts, bolts, wires, coils, things like that are also covered. So any imports of these goods starting this year in October will have to be accompanied by a document that documents the embedded emissions based on the methodologies that will be set out in this implementing act that the Commission may release today still. They're certainly coming very soon now. And then only from 2026 onwards, however, so in the beginning, it's only emissions reporting. So imports have to be accompanied by emissions reports. From 2026 onwards, the importers will also have to purchase certificates priced at the price of the European emissions trading system allowances. There's an additional quirk for those, if anybody's worried, oh, this will start very soon. Actually, it starts relatively gradually, not only with this transitional period of only reporting and then starting in 2026, but even from 2026 onwards, the payment is prorated for the amount of free allocation in the EU ETS. So in the beginning, when European producers still get 90% of their allowances for free in these industries, the payment will only be 10%. By 2034, however, it will then gradually expand to be 100% of the embedded carbon and EU carbon price. And one final detail, and with that, I think I'll wrap up and hand back to you. One final and important detail, of course, for any discussion about carbon pricing is that the EU in this regulation sets out that carbon prices paid in countries of origin of these goods will be credited. So say if a Taiwanese company that exports iron or steel or aluminum to the EU is subject to a domestic carbon price, that payment can be credited, can be subtracted from the CBAM compliance obligation. There are still some technical details that also have to be worked out in an implementing act, and that has yet to be released, so we don't know exactly what will be allowed and what not. Some have, for instance, suggested that maybe voluntary carbon market activities or Article 6 activities should be counted. The Commission at least has been somewhat more cautious and suggested that only a traditional carbon tax or emissions trading system would be counted towards this crediting of carbon pricing paid in the country of origin, minus any exemptions, any rebates, any free allocation, etc. But still, it is, I think, a powerful incentive for all trade partners of the EU that trade in these covered goods, steel, aluminum, cement, etc., to introduce their own domestic carbon pricing systems. And that is partly, I think, why we're also seeing some more impetus in many countries that trade heavily with the EU to accelerate their carbon pricing. And with that, I'll give back to you, but I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions now or later that might come up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll come back later in our general discussion and let the audience to raise the questions. Okay, so let's move to Axel. Well, we all know that Axel has been the expert in the field, and today he's going to introduce to us quite a special issue because just like the audience probably know that Taiwan has been we call the information communication technology manufacturing supply chain in the world, and most of those major companies, when they are doing this global operation, they need to count on something to solve their green supply problem, to green the supply chain. So somehow, in addition to the renewable certificate, and also they need to count on some mitigation outcome units in the near future. So I think Axel is going to explore the possible, how to say that, the moving channel that Taiwan's company could do. Okay, you can have the floor now, please.
Thank you very much. And of course, I'm really happy to speak at this event on important topics. And my predecessors have already raised various issues relevant for Article 6 and also for crediting. So please show next slide. So just to frame, well, all of you here in the negotiations probably have heard about the two forms of international carbon markets under Article 6. So there's Article 6.2, the bilateral mechanism, which is not under UN FCCC oversight. So countries have a high degree of freedom to engage in groups of 2 or more countries. And then, of course, the Article 6.4 mechanism, which has in the past often been called Sustainable Development Mechanism. That's not its formal name. It doesn't have a formal name. It's still the 6.4 mechanism. I hope at some point it will get a good name, because for the outside world, of course, it's a ridiculous acronym to call it like this. And that's a mechanism which follows on the footsteps of the CDM. So it has a supervisory body under the UNFCCC. This supervisory body has already met several times. It will approve methodologies. It will register activities. So this mechanism shall learn from the experiences that we've had under the CDM. Of course, both mechanisms have common principles. They want to have a high level of environmental integrity. They shall avoid double counting. And of course, they also shall help in increasing the ambition of the NDCs. And that's something which is new, which has not existed in the past, where you just wanted to have an offsetting one-to-one. Next, please. So why is this relevant for Taiwan? Of course, you know Taiwan is not a member of the UNFCCC, it's not a member of the UN, so it can not directly participate in the UNFCCC mechanisms. But Taiwan is a good global citizen and is engaging in climate change mitigation. And of course, given its status of highly developed country, it has now introduced quite interesting legislation. And this legislation has relevant provisions with regard to emissions credits and offsetting. So there are plans to set up a carbon tax, and that this also international credits can be used. Initially, it was for up to 10%, and that's what is listed here. Today, I've learned from my Taiwanese colleagues that apparently in the current version, the 10% has been scrapped, so even more credits could be used. We also see a lot of interest of relevant companies to engage in offsetting, for example, in the context of imports of fossil fuel. And there's also quite some interest to set up a carbon exchange. You've seen this in other countries in the Asian region, like in Singapore. But so it shows that the whole gamut of policy instruments that are necessary to generate demand for Article 6 credits in Taiwan is there. Next. So what do we need to actually enable Taiwan to use Article 6 ITMOs? And now we have to become a bit technical. And of course, you know that we have negotiations ongoing in Article 6 that discuss some of those aspects as well. So Article 6.2 requires that the host country of an Article 6 activity, regardless whether it's 6.2 or 6.4, needs to specify the uses of the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And there are 3 ways to use those ITMOs. They can be used against an NDC, and that's what we, for example, have in the case of Switzerland, where the fossil fuel importers have a domestic obligation to provide certificates, and these certificates shall be used by the government in context of NDC implementation. So it's clear they will need ITMOs. And for that purpose, they've set up a foundation which is called CLIC, Climate Compensation, and this foundation has mobilized a lot of the Article 6 pilot activities around the world. Then we have the so-called international mitigation purposes, and this would be stuff that's outside of the Paris Agreement, but still under international agreement. And currently it would only be CORSIA for the international airline sector. In the future, it might be also the International Maritime Organization. And then we have the other purposes, and that's, of course, where it's now getting interesting for Taiwan. Voluntary offsetting, national targets beyond NDCs, and, of course, especially this third usage type is highly relevant for Taiwan, because Taiwan can now use an ITMO that it receives from another country for those other international mitigation purposes. The criteria for the authorization and the timing of the authorization are determined by the host country. And of course, the host country needs to have the institutional infrastructure in place to authorize the use of ITMOs. What's also important, and that is now relevant because Taiwan is mirroring the NDCs, that the use has to be done in the same time period of the NDC for which the credit has been generated. And that's, of course, important because it means you can't bank huge amounts of ITMOs over decades. You need to use them in a period which is having a maximum of 10 years. And host countries, of course, as they voluntarily participate in these Article 6 activities, they can indicate the types of activities and also the share of the mitigation outcome they intend to authorize. Some of you may have seen the Ghanaian carbon market framework, where it's clearly stated which is the list of activity types. India has recently published 13 activity types to be eligible under Article 6.2. So we see every week or 2 weeks a new country coming up with these approaches. What we still have a lack of clarity and what is still being negotiated is the exact arrangements for authorization. At what time is actually the so-called first transfer deemed to have happened. So there are still a bit of open strands, but overall we have the key ingredients in place, and actually the first authorizations have been granted, for example, by Ghana for Switzerland in February of this year. Next. So the big question, of course, is now the corresponding adjustments. As we know that Taiwan is not a party to the UNFCCC, but Taiwan wants to ensure that it has credits of high environmental integrity. It, of course, needs to ensure that the corresponding adjustments have actually taken place on the side of the host country. And here we get into a bit of muddied waters, because for the ITMOs that are authorized for other international mitigation purposes, the first transfer is the authorization, issuance, or use or cancellation of the ITMO. And of course, this can be extremely different points in time. So authorization, of course, would be the earliest possible point in time. Issuance could be later if, for example, there is a blanket authorization which is considered by a number of parties. And the use of or cancellation in the context of the voluntary activity, that could theoretically take place much, much later, many years later. And of course, this generates different types of risks. So, for example, if you have the corresponding adjustment at authorization, it could well happen that the ITMO is not really generated because, the project may not achieve the mitigation. So that, of course, would be a relevant risk, and we've seen such risks occurring on the CDM and playing an important role. So if the trigger is only the use, then we have this problem that it may be much later than the actual issuance of the credit, and it may well be in an NDC period which is far in the future. And that, of course, generates a problem if one wants to follow the Article 6 rules to the letter. In my view, the most practical approach would be at issuance, because you're sure you have the credit in your hand, but there will not be any further delay. What is also important, of course, that the parties must apply the same accounting method throughout the NDC period. So the country in the beginning needs to think very carefully which timing it wants to achieve. Next. So here we just give a table that gives the possible authorization scenarios. It comes from an OECD report. And what I don't go now in all the details, but what is crucial for the Taiwanese case are the two last options. So you have a party A that transfers as the first transfer to a non-party entity D, which of course would be Taiwan in our case, or Taiwanese companies. This would require an authorization towards other international mitigation purposes, and the party A would apply the corresponding adjustment. But we could, of course, also have secondary transactions, and that's quite important because not many people think about those, where a party that is not the first transferring party sells the ITMO to the Taiwanese entity, And there, of course, we don't have a corresponding adjustment linked to that transfer. Of course, the first transferring partner from which this ITMO originates has done the corresponding adjustment at a certain point in time. But yeah, so it's important to understand that secondary transfers can generate some challenges here. Next. Under 6.4, the authorization is relatively akin to what we saw under the CDM, so we'll have it at the activity level. The host party authorizes the entities that want to engage in an activity. And what is quite important is that other participating parties, that means buyers, they must authorize entities prior to the first transfer of the emission reduction, which is important and more constraining than we have under Article 6.2. We know, of course, that the usages of the 6.4 YARs can be the same as under Article 6.2, and those ITMOs that have, there's emission reductions that have been authorized under 6.4 become ITMOs and then follow the same procedures than the ITMOs under 6.2. What should, of course, also be noted is that there may be the so-called mitigation contributions that could be used in the voluntary carbon market. But, of course, if Taiwan wants, as a government, use the ITMOs, then the mitigation contributions would not be eligible. Of course, if there are private sector participants in Taiwan that want to get voluntary credits from 6.4, they may go for the mitigation contributions without authorization. Next. So the options that, in my view, are relevant for Taiwan are buying ITMOs that have the purpose that is applicable for the voluntary market. And of course, there could be a bottom-up approach. So the Taiwanese entities could go through the private voluntary carbon market programs. They are currently positioning themselves to play a role under the Article 6. And of course, if that is happening, there is still some contestation about this. Then there could be the direct acquisition of voluntary carbon standard credits or gold standard credits that have a corresponding adjustment and therefore are in ITMO. The top-down approach would be that one has a party that is friendly to Taiwan and that would then generate the ITMO and authorize them directly for other purposes. And then the ITMO would be cancelled and the cancellation certificate would be used by the Taiwanese entities. Next. So with regard to the legal framework, it would be important now to ensure that there is legislation that has a clear offset mechanism that allows to surrender international credits against the greenhouse gas reduction obligation or a carbon tax, because that would generate robust domestic demand for ITMO cancellation certificates. We've seen, for example, Colombia or in South Africa that allowing offsetting against the carbon tax is a very powerful incentive and has led to a thriving use of offset credits in those countries. What is also, of course, important is to identify early enough the partner countries for the top-down strategy. With regard to the tracking and recording, if there is the top-down strategy with other governments, then it needs to be ensured that there would be Taiwanese accounts in those registries to allow holding and then cancellation of the ITMOs. Taiwan could also have a national registry for such cancellation certificates, but this is free to choose. And with regard to reporting, of course, the reporting requirements of Article 6.2 could be mirrored by the reporting of the Taiwanese government. And of course, then the Taiwanese government would have to ensure that ITMO's cancellation certificates that come into the country and are being used by other entities are duly reflected. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Asher. I think that the regulator and also the entrepreneur leaders of Taiwan will be very pleasant to hear about your introduction. And I think it might be very helpful in the near future for Taiwan's the manufacturing supply chain when they try to solve the issue through this Article 6 application. And I think next presenter, Mr. Lian, is going to explain why the Taiwanese regulator and or industrial people would really need this kind of assistance out of this. Please, you can have the floor now.
Dear colleagues, good evening. It is an honor for me to have this opportunity to represent ITRI and share with you the current greenhouse gas management policy in Taiwan and our future plans to align with the implementation of Article 6. Next slide, please. Just a moment, please.
Oh, okay. Well, let's move back. Okay.
Sorry about that. Next slide, please. In 2015, Taiwan legally committed to reduce 50% of greenhouse gas emission from 2005 level by 2050. Additionally, Taiwan also set a target to reduce 20% of greenhouse gas emission by 2030. Meanwhile, in this year, we have already enacted an amendment of Climate Change Response Act to achieve net zero emission in 2050. So in this regard, we have strengthened our 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target to 23 to 25% off. Next slide, please. Specifically, the net zero transition requires to address various aspects, such as including energy, industry, lifestyle, and society. The timely implementation of the carbon pricing instrument will provide a clear policy signal and enhance business resilience to climate impact. So, achieving the climate targets by 2030 will rely on mitigation efforts under Article 6 and international cooperation. However, the key focus of implementation remains on promoting sustainable development and avoid double counting. Next slide, please. Taiwan has initiated a policy instrument measurement for the carbon fee mechanism and expects to launch it officially next year. Although we said that emission trading under a cap and trade system is included in the legal framework, but will be implemented later due to some consideration, such as the industry will to further have the readiness for carbon pricing implementation. So the legislative inclusion of ITMO is essential in fulfilling the global emission reduction responsibility. Right now, in the Climate Response Act, we are able to legally accept the ITMOs in the future. Next slide, please. So the inclusive policy design is crucial, and the various voluntary supportive mitigation activity will strengthen the achievement of the reduction targets as complementary measures, such as Taiwan has to incorporate a lot of emission reduction offset program into the environmental impact assessment commitment to further regulate the main emitters to have some social responsibility to reduction in their future business plan. So Taiwan also demonstrates its utmost commitment to achieve net zero emissions. Next slide, please. So when we further consider about a different approach of climate governance, we can differentiate some different regions, such as the Paris Agreement region. Also, Taiwan is also a manufacturing-oriented country. So the global voluntary carbon markets will be to apply for the supply chain demands. Meanwhile, in the local, we have a Taiwan different governments to assist the main emitters to reach the net zero emission target. So Taiwan is also want to establish a carbon credit exchange this year, making it necessary to integrate the various different governance pathway. On the supply side, the comprehensive integration consideration will involve the Paris Agreement mechanisms, international independent mechanism, and the domestic mitigation measures. On the demand side, different purposes will be considered, such as for the legal compliance or carbon neutrality goals can be achieved by obtaining the required credits or mitigation outcomes through the exchange system. In the future, the focus will be on promoting implementation efficiently and the digitalization, which are very important to concern area. Next slide, please. In simple terms, the source of carbon credits may include ITMOs, different offset credits, and even emission allowance from the ETS system. In terms of Article 6 implementation, the digitalization and the smart contract of information with international data linkage will be crucial in avoid pitfall and double counting for transaction and accounting. ITRI will assist the government to look forward to enhance future cooperation with among the stakeholders to contribute more effectively global goals. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll come back later for the further deliberations in the topic. And we all understand that whatever we would like to do in the future to serve your mitigation purpose, it's key that we should do that in compliance with the required transparency requirements. So next, I would like to invite Ms. Hai to present in this regard. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wei Chen, and I'm the associate researcher at Industrial Technology Research Institute. And I would like to share with you about the transparency framework for carbon pricing mechanism and what it has its implications for Taiwan. So firstly, I would like to set the scenes for what the presentation, the main focus of my presentation today is that we know that carbon pricing covers many different mechanisms. But what I would like to focus on is under the Paris Agreement. So firstly, if we all look into what does the Paris Agreement say about carbon pricing, we all know that Paris Agreement, the main objective for market-based instruments is to enhance cooperations and to achieve some mitigation outcomes that cannot be done domestically. So in terms of the market-based instruments, there's Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 mechanisms, as mentioned by Dr. Miklova before. And if we look into Article 6.4, then we can see that Paris agreements ask countries to put in place robust accounting measures to avoid double counting of emission reductions and to increase transparency, which in order to enhance the environmental integrity of the market-based approaches. Then it leads to us what are the sound accounting principles that mentions by the Paris Agreement. And here I categorize it into like four categories of the accounting principles of mitigation goals under the Paris Agreement. So first is defining mitigation goal, and second is tracking progress over the achievement. Third is principle of mitigation outcomes, and fourth is about reporting, review, and compliance. And we can see from the slides that actually the first two categories is about the mitigation goal of a national, so what we call a national NDC, and how we can actually track the progress about the achievement of the NDC. And then the third and the fourth is more like the focus of my presentation today, that the principle of mitigation outcomes, which should avoid double counting, and the calculation of reduction resource should be happened in the period of NDC stage or the NDC period. Then first, with regards to reporting, and then it's the importance of what information should be included in this international reporting systems and under what review. So if we look at the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, which we call the Enhanced Transparency Framework, it's the backbone of the Paris Agreement, not only because not only about the transparency framework itself, but also about the linkage of this framework to other articles on the Paris agreements, like Article 4 about NDC, or Article 6 of market-based instruments, and the most important with regards to Article 14 of global stock take. Then what is actually the Enhanced Transparency Framework is actually, it is the first globally unified transparency framework, which differs from the pre-2020 MRV framework that divide the reporting obligations into Annex 1 parties and non-Annex 1 parties. It asks or requires all parties to follow the same rules or the same reporting frameworks. That is to say, like, every countries need to submit biannual transparency reports every 2 years, and the national inventory report every year, and the national communications report every 4 years. And this is the the reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement, Article 13. Then what are the reporting obligations under the Article 6 and its linkage to Enhanced Transparency Framework? As mentioned also by Dr. Miklova before, there are certain requirements. So now parties needs to, the parties that would like to join this mechanisms needs to report, to have 3 reports: initial report, annual information, and regular information. For initial report, it's indicate that it should submit no later than the authorized of at most from the cooperative approach. Or if it's practical, it could be submit together with biannual transparency report. So as it is happens, or it should be submit no later than authorization at most, then it should include the information on the description of NDC and the ITMO metric and what corresponding adjustments it's planned to use. Also, it should include the quantified mitigation information, so what parties expected the mitigation outcomes for the period of time. And it's also need to include a descriptive of cooperative approaches, including what authorization process, whether it is already authorized by parties, and how it's planned to meet the environmental integrities of this cooperative approach or mitigation project. Then about annual information, parties need to submit this on an annual basis by no later than 15th of April every year. And it's supposed to be include like the quantity informations with regards to mitigation project or the ITMOs from the cooperative approach, like the informations on how many quantities of authorization ITMO for use towards NDC, other purpose of other international mitigation purpose, and what are the quantities that ITMO has first transfer, cancellation, and so on. Then with regards to the regular information, it includes the information on updates on the initial report and how corresponding adjustments has taken place and how cooperative approaches contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions of the participating country and the implementation of its NDC. So we have looked at the information that need to include in those three report or information. Then if we take a look examples from the Ghana Carbon Market Framework just published last year, and the timing of those three those three reports are as indicated in the slides. So initial report, as I mentioned earlier, that is no later than the authorization of ITMO. So it happens on this pre-activity development stage. And in terms of annual information and the regular information should happen or submit on the transactions stage. And I forgot to mention about the regular information is that the outcomes, the decisions from the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement ask parties to submit regular information as the annex to the biannual transparency report. And now I would like to share with some examples of those reports. So Switzerland has just published the first initial report in May this year. So as we can see from the slides, that the outlines include a participation responsibility. So Paris Agreement, the Article 6 of Paris Agreement asks for the certain responsibility of parties needs to follow if they wish to participate in this Article 6 mechanism. So countries need to explain or describe how it fulfills those responsibilities in this initial report. Then there's the description of parties' national determined contributions, like what target the NDC is and whether it's updated on a regular basis. And then there are the informations on ITMO metric and what methods for applying corresponding adjustments, whether it's used like the average methods or the multiple years methods. And there are the informations on each cooperative approaches. So it includes the description of what this project is and some informations. Then we can see, as we have mentioned earlier, that the most important thing about this transparency framework or this reporting system is to make sure to avoid double counting and to apply environmental integrity. So we can see from the slides of this initial report, it should include a proof of authorization and how parties plan this project to meet the environmental integrity criteria. Then there are some information for the annual information, hypothetical, that, so as I mentioned earlier, it's about the quantity of ITMO authorized first transfer holding, etc. So we can see from the slide that in each the project year of this mitigation project, then it's listed like the different quantity. And then for regular information, the most important, it's indicated ITMO first transferred, the quantity also, and what is the annual emission balance after the corresponding adjustment. So we look at what happens internationally and what different countries have been doing as an example. Then if we take a look at Taiwan, so as the Climate Change Response Act, which adopted on February 15 this year, in its Article 13, it's saying that actually the central competent authority should establish a greenhouse gas emission inventory, and it should compile a greenhouse gas report every 3 years. And what does it mean in terms of its linkage to meet the environmental reporting or transparency framework? As Dr. Mikolova mentioned earlier, we have to voluntarily link ourselves or to follow the international requirements in terms of the transparency framework. So that is what ITRI has been doing in support or in consultation with Taiwan EPA. So firstly, we have to establish the reporting mechanism that meets enhanced transparency framework. And we actually have the systems of national inventory report and the greenhouse gas report to submit every 3 years. Then we are currently take a look or a deep look into the content or the outline of the biennial transparency report and the greenhouse gas reports, to see how we can merge or we can kind of adjust our reporting systems to meet this international requirements. And for potential Article 6 mechanism participation, I think it's important that we firstly establish domestic regulation and institutions for arrangements for calculating, if we actually have some ITMOs, or what about the achievements of our NDC and the reporting system. And then we have to follow the rules under the Article 6 about the reports, that's the 3 reports or information I have mentioned earlier. And also, I think it's great to establish collaboration with country already drafting reports or doing some kind of capacity building support, for instance, Japan or Switzerland to engage together to this capacity building collaboration. So actually, we are still learning while the negotiation goes on. So we are still learning, and we are looking forward to cooperate with countries for this transparency framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tai. I think that we have about 6 minutes left. So any of the audience here would like to raise a question? Yes, please. 1 minute, please. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Michele Stua from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies. The question, more than on the very last part, is more on EU ETS. My question is, does EU foresee any form of reciprocity, meaning that when EU firms will, if ever, export products in countries where the ETS provides higher pricing of CPIs, of carbon pricing, compared to EU ETS, will the EU make obligation for these firms to cover the difference? Otherwise, if not, there might be a breach on the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Thank you.
So that will be the question for Professor Mehalin, right? So Professor Mehalin, can you hear that?
Yes, I heard it. Thank you. And I know Michele from his work and from having had exchanges with him in the past, but I'm not sure I captured the full brunt of this question. You were saying if other countries have a higher price than the EU, if I understood correctly, how would reciprocity work in that case? Let me try at least an interpretation. So let's assume hypothetically Taiwan, with its domestic carbon price, exceeds the EU carbon price and then exports products to the EU. There is no provision there. Article 9 of the CBAM regulation clearly would state that that would be deducted from the CBAM compliance obligation and essentially would go to zero. But there would not be any sort of additional obligation where the EU, for instance, were to pay Taiwanese producers for the difference. Taiwan would have to introduce its own carbon border adjustment mechanism to deal with the lower EU price, if you like, and make sure that there's no competitive distortion. And that's how border carbon adjustment or border adjustments more generally work, based on the destination principle. So each country essentially deals with what's coming in and rebates what's going out, but not in order to not create confusion. I hope I interpreted it correctly, and if not, maybe we can take this up bilaterally at another point.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mehalin. Any other question? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Anton Svetov. I was an Article 6 negotiator and currently consult on carbon markets. So I wanted to ask a question about what are the factors behind compliance systems allowing or disallowing international offsets into the systems, and maybe more specifically, what sort of, if we're talking about the EU ETS and 6.4, because I think it was mentioned over the course of these days and today definitely, what would be the main factors behind the decision to allow those? Would it be something that has to be in the 6.4 outcome that would convince the regulators to introduce that, or is that mostly due to the considerations within the regulation? I mean, just sort of I wanted a general comment on what the factors could be behind that and how could that work if
Well, I think it's a question for almost most of the panelists. So next time, let's start from Asia first. Maybe you would like to say something, and then.
I think in legally, we can also assume that NDC has some kind of natural cap for each country. So when we regulate all such major emitters, so we have different options. So in Taiwan, right now we set a carbon fee mechanism first, because you don't have to set to a different setter have for a cap to apply for in a cap and trade system, because in some very small country, or you only have some very small amount of a player to join the cap and trade system. Sometimes we have some fluidity issue to deal with the emission trading system. So in Taiwan right now, we apply for the carbon fee system. Will be earlier to let the industry to used to have some carbon pricing instrument, and that will be also to comply with the such as a CBAM, because those are all main emitters. So if they have more opportunity to join the carbon to go with the carbon pricing instrument, will be easier to for them to greener their supply chain demands. Thank you.
Okay, I think that Professor Mehalin might need to would like to supplement that, and I just add on one more question for the same purpose. Do you think that the carbon levy now collected by Taiwan is explicit enough for the future? I mean, the CBAM baseline adjustment, And also, because the time limited, so when you are thinking about that, I try to finish the further discussion. So I would also like to ask Azel, maybe in the future you will comment on this. How do you think about the contemporary, the integrative approach of Taiwan in carbon pricing? Do you think that workable with what you suggest in the near future for this Article 6 application or compatibility? And for both Ms. Tai and Mr. Lian, how do you think about the future DMRV or data trust system might bring the impact to Taiwan? Okay, so Professor Merlin, start from yours.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll keep it very brief. So to the question from the participant just now, I've had conversations with staff at the European Commission at DG Klima about whether or not Article 24 in the EU ETS directive might ever be reactivated. It would allow offsetting under the EU ETS. The appetite is very, very small given the problems 10 years ago with the CDM and the abrupt decision to delink, if you like, the EU ETS from. So a lot would have to happen. I think high prices, growing abatement costs. There are, I think, various factors that together could change that, but it's still some work to be done, I think, to convince the right policymakers that this should be an option again. And of course, having a robust Article 6 framework would help. On the question of Professor Fan, if it is a mandatory system and it is a largely sort of a traditional carbon tax, I believe that it's got the best chances of being recognized. Of course, we'll only know the full details once the EU adopts the implementing act, but I would be optimistic on that front. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Then, Axel?
Well, of course, the key question is always, what will be the price in the Taiwanese system? If the price is low, then it may be too expensive to bring in. So I would be looking forward to seeing how the overall supply-demand situation within Taiwan is and whether the carbon price will be set at a level where Article 6 really can play a role, because it's clear that ITMOs will have much higher prices than the voluntary carbon market credits that we are currently seeing being traded at rock bottom prices after the recent scandals.
Well, thank you very much. So, Mr. Lian?
I think the digital MRV and the tokenized of ITMO will be the future in management about carbon pricing. Because you can imagine if you have 20,000 of ITMO, but actually from 2,000 cooperation projects or from maybe hundreds of countries. For any administration, they don't have the capability, don't have the time to review case by case. It will be very time and efficient. So I think that digitalized and tokenized will be very crucial in the future to link it with the international registry. Thank you.
So I think as Mr. Lian has mentioned, it is definitely the future of the market base or the international carbon market. And if we see it from the transparency framework, it's definitely enhance or decrease the work of how parties like to compile all this information in terms of reporting. And also, I think the transparency framework is not only about the reporting itself, but it's also about the international reviewing process. So this digitalization of MRV or the data trust mechanisms would definitely increase the efficiency of how this review process work. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think time is running out. And just for your reference, because we talk a lot about Taiwan, Taiwan has been ranked by 22nd as the major emitter in the world. And also in terms of per capita, up to for 10.77 tons per capita. That's ranked by 19. So That's why the Taiwanese industry, when they face the challenge to green the supply chain, they really need to take this new market mechanism into consideration seriously. So I'm a law professor from Taiwan, and I'm also serve as the chairman of the ICD. And in the near future, I think I will work together with ASA to provide with all the gentlemen and ladies a better, even better platform for the dialogue. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for your patience too. Thank you.